Welcome back. We are now on our third lecture of Egypt, and you can see from the timeline that there's a big chunk we're covering here. This is known as the Middle Kingdom, and we're leaving the age of the giant pyramids behind, and we're going to look today at a few pharaohs and some artwork inside tombs, and we're going to spend the bulk of the lecture, though, talking about the Temple of Amun at Karnak. And we're going to talk about that because it spans multiple dynasties and how it's been built over and added to over time. And there's a video that I want you to watch, which is really good, about the rituals that happened at the temple. So we are done with giant pyramids, but a lot of the things are going to stay the same. And I know you know this now, but consistency is really important, so that's why things will stay the same. During the Middle Kingdom, the city of Thebes in Upper Egypt rose to prominence, and it became the cultural, artistic, and governmental center of Egypt. So while I'm presenting today, I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind. How did artists build upon the past, yet still retain a sense of stability and consistency? So the question is, there's some evolution here, but it still seems like it fits into everything we have seen thus far. And I want you to keep an eye out for that. All right, let's begin with these two sculptures. And before you get your final look at them, I want to say a few things. First of all, things fell apart in Egypt by the end of the Old Kingdom, and the upper and lower empire basically split apart. And then this guy comes along, Mentuhotep, who reunites Upper and Lower Egypt after a period of political fragmentation. And then artists from Thebes in Upper Egypt had to learn artistic conventions from Lower Egypt after reunification. And their skills and statuary were not as advanced as those in the north. So Mentuhotep here on the left is actually newer than Menkaure on the right. And Mentuhotep is built in the Theban style, and Menkaure is in the Memphite style. So I basically told you which one is older. It was going to be a trick question. But I still am going to ask you to compare these two. And I want you to explain why it would have been a trick question. Like why does one look older than the other, although it's newer? Or maybe you don't think that. But basically I want you to compare these two. I want you to compare the physique, the stance, the stone, the idealized features, everything you can about these two. Mentuhotep was also responsible for the first important monument of this period. This is known as Mentuhotep's mortuary complex. And it's loosely modeled on the funerary monuments of his Theban ancestors. So they did things differently in this part of Egypt. It's built on a grand scale, and it's against these sheer cliffs of western Thebes. And the complex is centered on a terraced temple, and it had pillared porticos. If you forgot what that means, here is a picture of the Apadana from Persepolis that we looked at. So pillars, those big tall posts, and a portico is a front porch. Some experts believe that it possibly had a small pyramid on the top level, but this idea has been debated. We will see an image of this pyramid on top of this temple in the next lecture. I'll explain in a second. The design represented a perfect union of architecture and landscape that was really unique for its time. The complex also had painted reliefs of ceremonial scenes and, of course, many hieroglyphic texts. It also served as the inspiration for later, larger mortuary temples like the one of Queen Hatshepsut, which we will talk about in the New Kingdom. And if you look very closely, to the left there, you will see the smaller temple of Mentuhotep. Here's another Middle Kingdom pharaoh, Senusret III. His military campaigns gave rise to an era of peace and economic prosperity that reduced the power of regional rulers and led to a revival in craft work, trade, and urban development. Senusret was among the few Egyptian kings who was actually deified and honored with a cult during his own lifetime. I love this sculpture because it leads to a lot of speculation, and here we go. Compared to what we've seen thus far, this sculpture seems to have a lot of personality. The eyes are protruding from hollow eye sockets with pouches and lines under them. The mouth, the lips seem to be turned down a little bit, as if it's in a form of like a grimace of bitterness. The ears are enormous and they are protruding outward. And this is kind of in contrast with Old Kingdom portraits and statues that are more generic. This seems to have a little more individuality, perhaps influenced by the Theban style. Some have argued that Senusret wanted to be represented as a lonely and disenchanted ruler. He's human before divine, and he's consumed by worries and by his responsibilities. Others have thought perhaps the statues originally would convey the idea of a dreadful tyrant, able to see and hear everything under his strict control, thus the big ears and big eyes, increasing his senses. In Beni Hassan, there are many rock-cut tombs, and this is kind of a new form of tomb. Basically, they excavated into the face of cliffs, and then all features are carved out of the living rock. And then often it was painted inside as well. A typical tomb included an entrance portico, a porch, a main hall, a shrine with a burial chamber under the offering chapel, and then it, of course, contained objects needed for afterlife or continuance of everyday life. This is also something that we will see in the New Kingdom when we look at Abu Simbel with Ramses. It's little things like this, by the way, that make me love Egyptian art. In a tomb, there was this tiny model of a granary of people baking bread, the whole system happening, and it was hidden in a chamber. It was part of a set of detailed models that depicted weaving, carpentry, and food production. Inside the tomb, these little kinds of models. Why? Why were they there? You should know the answer to this by now. I want to take a second to talk about the tomb relief sculptures. So relief sculpture basically means either you've sort of carved into the wall or you have removed part of the wall to leave the leftover figures. And in Egypt, they do both of those things. These are tomb reliefs from the tomb of Usuer, who was a sculptor himself. And so we're not sure if he did these sculptures or if he had apprentices that did them. Regardless, there's a lot to talk about here. So first of all, we know that tomb reliefs represent daily life, or the things that the deceased would need for eternity. Relief sculpture, you can't steal, like you can steal small statues or jewelry, so they're super important. You might notice that the detail, or the bottom left part of that bigger wall, is unfinished, and you can still see the grid from the work that the sculptors would do. And this grid is used as a tool for consistency. And now we know that consistency is very important. So here are the details. A standing figure occupies 18 squares from the sole of their feet to their hairline. And the knee line is at 1/3 the height and it comes in at square 6. The lower buttock line at 1/2 height comes in at 9. The elbow line at 2/3 comes in at 12. Neck and shoulders come in at 16. The calf line on the lower leg between knee and sole comes at square 3. One vertical line of the grid ran through the ear and divided the figure into two. The grid allowed other parts of the body to be aligned. For example, line 17 goes between the nose and lip. Line 14 through the nipple. Line 11 through the small of the back for men. Line 12 for women. The length of a hanging forearm was 5 squares long, usually from elbow to outstretched fingertips. In male figures, the body measured 5 squares across the shoulder at line 15 and 2.5 or less at 11, so that means they had a tapered waist. In female figures, it's 5 across the shoulders at line 15 and 2 at the small of the back at line 12. The distance between the armpits is usually 4 squares for male figures, 3 for females. Over time, these proportions changed, but not much, because we understand what change means, right? The Nile will not do its job if you start messing with things. Just like we saw in the Mesopotamian cultures, the relief sculptures were often painted to sort of bring out those figures, especially since Egyptian relief sculpture are often low relief, otherwise known as bas relief or sometimes sunken relief, which means they remove the figure, not the space around the figure. Another thing we saw in Mesopotamia is that often scenes are organized in bands or registers. Egyptian registers can run horizontally or vertically, making reading them sometimes confusing. One convention, just like the grid and all of those measurements, was color. Women were often an ochre color, more of like a brownish yellow, and men were red-orange. At the end of the Middle Kingdom, the god Amun starts to rise in prominence, and by the time we get to the New Kingdom, Amun is the god, for the most part. We're going to spend the rest of this lecture talking about this one temple complex at Karnak, which is actually across the river from Mentuhotep's little tomb that we looked at earlier. So before this incarnation of this temple complex existed, there were older buildings there that kind of were swept away because pharaohs needed the space for their own constructions. After a while, though, pharaohs would just add on to this as opposed to destroying something and then building their own thing. So the temple complex gets kind of sprawling because of all the additions that happen from later pharaohs. This actually might seem contradictory, this idea of sweeping away, because we've already talked about, like, you can't get rid of old things, right? You need to hold on to everything. So they didn't really destroy it, they actually just kind of buried things and then built on top of them. So in essence, statues and other things still existed, they were just underneath this. Construction on this great temple of Amun started in the Middle Kingdom, about 2040 to 1782 BCE, through the New Kingdom, which we will talk about next time, and into the Ptolemaic dynasty. The most famous Ptolemaic that you know of is Cleopatra. It's one of the largest religious buildings in the world. Approximately 30 pharaohs contributed to the buildings. Thebes was the center of the cult of Amun, and the Egyptians believed that Thebes was the first city built on that primordial mound which rose from the waters during creation that we talked about in the first lecture. Karnak had become the most important sanctuary of Amun and Ra, sun gods. It was built on the east bank of the Nile River, and across the river in the west is where you find pyramids and tombs because it references death, because in the west is where the sun sets. There are two axes that define the architecture of Karnak. The major axis is west-east, and it follows the path of the sun, and it's perpendicular to the Nile. And then there's a smaller north-south axis that runs parallel to the Nile. The pylons, or gateways, in the temple represent the horizon. That's why you can see them on the east-west axis. Further into the temple, the floor rises until it reaches the sanctuary of Amun. It gives the impression of a rising mound, like that primordial mound out of the swirling waters. That part of the temple was built high enough to usually avoid flooding, but the lower areas would be underwater. This is a great shot of the temple roof because it represented the sky, so it was painted blue and decorated with stars and birds. The columns were designed with lotus, papyrus, and palm plant accents. This type of structure was common in ancient Egyptian temples and supposedly represents a papyrus marsh, which is the Egyptian symbol of creation. Here's a question you will see in your lecture questions. How is a marsh symbolic of creation and unification? Leading up to those pylons on the east-west axis, you see this kind of avenue of cryosphinxes. They are the newest part of the complex, and the rams represent Amun. And the rams are actually more important than bulls to the Egyptians. Also, I think they were put there by Ramses II, so it possibly represents Ramses II as well. We'll talk about him next time. There's a very short part of the Engineering and Empire video I want you to watch. It's about 4 minutes long. But it shows the process of them making these columns and putting them into place, and it's fascinating. And it has to do with like removing sand. Anyway, you have to watch it. It's like 4 minutes. The Great Hypostyle Hall was constructed during the New Kingdom. There are a number of columns that supported the flat stone roof. The hall covers an area of 50,000 square feet. The roof that's now fallen was supported by 134 columns in 16 rows. And the two middle rows were higher than the others. And you can see that there's this kind of elevated part with a clerestory. A clerestory is basically a wall of windows. The columns in the hypostyle hall are enormous. You have to have like a bunch of people standing around them holding hands. They're covered in hieroglyphics. There are different symbols used for worship, and the pharaoh is making offerings to Amun. There's a video that I want you to watch. It's called Timeline, and it's where this woman goes to this temple and she engages in these activities, and it's really great. So please watch the Timeline video as well. I'm going to end on this slide. It's kind of silly, but I want you to see the difference between 1500 years of Western art, where you have this post-Roman Empire carving, and then about 1400 years later, you've got a toilet as a work of art. And then in Egypt, in the same span, the things look almost exactly the same. I have a feeling there is a discussion question forming from this slide.